This is my 1969 Honda CL90. I got this motorcycle non-running back in high school about 6 or 7 years ago, and after tinkering, it did run, but not well enough to be drivable further than a block or two. I tried fixing it, but honestly at the time, I wasn't very mechanically experienced, so I never got it working right, and quite honestly, possibly did some more harm to it as well. Basically, since then, I've moved out and on with my life, and it's been sitting ever since at my dad's storage, and through all those years, every time I think about it, I just get this deep pit of regret in my stomach, knowing I abandoned and possibly partly ruined this classic motorcycle. Since then, I've gotten pretty decent at working on cars though, and I recently got a Honda Aero scooter which has rekindled my interest in bikes, so it made me think, why not try to finally redeem myself and revive this thing? So, here we are now. I just brought this up today, and as you can tell it's raining. I'd usually keep my bike under a cover, but it was so dusty and dirty, I figured a rain bath wouldn't hurt. Plus, I'd hate to dirty up a perfectly good bike cover, I mean, come on. The rain also makes for a more dramatic opening, symbolizing its current and sad state. The CL90 is basically the same as the more common S90, the S standing for sport, but I'm unsure what the CL stands for. I like to think it stands for Craigslist though, since that's where I got the bike from and it just looks like a Craigslist purchase. Now, while the S90 was a street sports bike, the CL90 was a scrambler style, kinda like an old-fashioned dirt bike, though I wouldn't go off any jumps with this thing. The differences include slightly smaller wheels and different fenders, a skid plate on the engine, a raised exhaust which is currently off the bike, and the handlebars seem to be taller too. The other main difference is the CL90 is supposed to have a boxier silver gas tank to match the silver headlight shroud, but at some point someone replaced it with the red S90 tank. Other than that, they should be pretty much the same, with maybe a couple other minor differences I'm unaware of yet, but I'm sure will cause me complications later. The S90 and CL90 are also closely related to the less sporty but even more popular Trail CT90 and Cub C90, but there are a few more notable differences. The motorcycle needs a few things before I can try starting it, and as much as I want to get started working on it, I need to wait for a dry day because I don't have a garage at my apartment, and I don't think my girlfriend would be too happy if I brought this into the living room and decorated the floor with oily parts. Okay, it's a few days later and thankfully it stopped raining. For now. My first thing is to clean out my original carburetor. This one is a Mikuni brand, but these bikes also came with K-hins, but I'm unsure of the differences. As you can see, it's pretty shockingly dirty for sitting around unused in a garage for years, but it should hopefully clean up nice. If you look on the bike, you can see I have another carb on here. What happened was, back in the day, I had cleaned my original one, couldn't get the bike to run right, so I thought, well, why not buy a new carb? I didn't know it back then, but for old bikes like this, the only new carbs you can buy are cheap Chinese knockoff reproductions, which are a big crapshoot if they work or not. The new carb likely didn't help anything in the end, and it's usually best to try to rebuild an old original one if you can. One other issue with my old carb though that also convinced me to get a new one is the fact that the choke lever is broken. So before I start digging into it, I really want to get this broken choke lever sorted. As you can see on the knockoff carb, this is what it's supposed to look like. Without getting technical, on a carburetor, the choke is used to help start a cold engine by allowing more fuel into the mixture, so it's pretty important anytime you want to start your bike on a cold day. On my original carb, I remember using pliers to move it before, but that's impractical for the long term. Now, it's a bit of a stretch, but my immediate hope is that I can swap the lever from the Chinese carb over to the original one and maybe it'll fit, else I'll have to rig up something more custom. Well, look at that. I'll admit it doesn't fit perfect, so there's a bit of free play in it, but I think that'll do at least for now. Now it's time to take the carb apart and clean it up. The process here is basically take every little thing off the body, spray them all down with carb cleaner and put it all back together. Really spray down through every passage so nothing's clogged. Everything here only fits in its specific spot, so it's pretty hard to mess anything up as long as you don't lose anything. Other than the surface dirt, the inside really isn't bad, which I guess makes sense considering I already did this all about 7 years ago. These jets here are really important. This is what the gas passes through to the engine. Make sure all the little holes are clear. I'm going to use some thin wire to poke through them just in case. Overall, I do notice some wear on a few things, but I hope it's all fine enough to not cause any issues. You can get a rebuild kit for some of these parts like the jets and stuff, but those really shouldn't be necessary unless you got some good damage, I think. All back together, time to stick it on the bike now. Just unbolt the other carb and undo the throttle cable. It's threaded through the spring and slide, so it's a bit tricky to do. Throttle cable works. One thing I will say I prefer about the knockoff carb is it's held with bolts rather than studs and nuts. Here you can't reinstall the carb and air filter box without removing the intake pipe. Only 2 extra bolts, but still an extra step. Another thing too while I'm at it is this fuel line is a little longer than it needs to be and kind of dips down then back up. I don't think that really matters, but I don't want any possible thing restricting the flow of gas, so I'm gonna cut it to be more direct. And now everything back together. Okay, I noticed the threads that go into the cylinder head and hold the bolts for this intake manifold seem to be a bit stripped, like the bolts will tighten down and secure the pipe, but after a certain point they just seem to spin forever. Now again, they seem to hold everything together, but even if there is a little leak here, that will totally mess up how the engine runs and could possibly be what was wrong with the bike to begin with when I first got it. It especially makes sense the engine used to die once warmed up. The metal would get hotter and loosen things up even more. I've never actually done it before, but you can repair the threads, but I'm gonna leave it for now because I think at the very least the bike should still start so I have some proof it has some life before I start doing anything crazy. It just may not run very well. My old Kickstarter lever was stripped, but I just got my new one in the mail, so it's time to install it. The shaft itself has a bit of wear, I think, but I'm really hoping it's good enough to use because replacing it requires literally tearing the entire engine apart, which is not something I want to do right now. Alright, I got it tightened down, so let's give it a few test kicks. And yep, that's exactly what I was afraid of. That's definitely not going to help anything. I reseated the lever and tightened it as hard as I could, and I think if I'm just a little more on the gentle side, I can give it just enough kick to start it without breaking anything. You can also run and push start these bikes easily, which I have done before and may be a future solution, but I don't really want to do that until I know it can actually idle on its own. Now we can check for spark, but first I realize I need to install the battery. My old battery is probably long dead, so I already tossed it in the ocean, but luckily I did order a new 6-volt one. The only minor issue is the wires for it are pretty janky. The red positive one is fine, but the green ground must have been cut too short at some point, so my past self just taped some extra wire to extend it. I have no idea why I chose red of all colors for the negative end though. This should work, but I would like to minimize my issues of a weak wire as possible. I don't have crimps or solder on me, but this wire nut at least should be better than tape. My battery also came with some spare adapters, so I can take this one and use a bolt to hold the wire, then the other end plugs nicely into my battery. You know, I kinda realize I should have just bolted the green wire to my black one and removed the unnecessary red one in between. But I'll do that later, I swear. The black ground plugs right in now, but the red positive is now 2 male connectors, which, not to be homophobic, but really doesn't work in this case. Okay, my battery came with this fuse box that converts the male ends to female ones, And that makes sense, you probably want a fuse to not blow anything. With the battery hooked up and the key on, the electronics should work now, but for some reason, none of the lights come on. If I can't get any power anywhere, then I likely can't get any spark either. My only guess is my battery is just dead, which I have no way to test without a multimeter. But another likely issue is my key switch is busted and won't allow power to anything. Either way, I need to go to buy a multimeter to test this, so I'll have to make a run to the store. Okay, so I actually did some looking at the wiring diagram for the motorcycle, trying to see if anything at all stood out to me, and there's supposed to be 2 wires that go to the positive end of the battery. And sure enough, it was hidden, tucked away up here the whole time. And of course, this is the one that goes to the key switch. Now, I feel a little stupid because this also explains why the fuse has 2 wires sticking out of it, but how was I supposed to know? And now, what do you know? The headlight works, but only the front left turn signal works, though it doesn't even blink, but the tail light and brake light work. We'll look into that later though, cause who needs turn signals if the bike can't even drive? And of course, we now have spark as well, one step closer. Now, one last thing before calling it for the day, this spark plug is an NGK B6HS. The manual calls for a D6HS, which I cannot seem to find anywhere. Most places selling a spark plug for this bike list a D8HA. So, okay, I need a D6HS, but I have a B6HS. What's the difference? And why do places only sell a D8HA? I did some digging on what any of this actually means, and if I'm reading this right, the strange thing is the only difference is the B and D represent the threading, which doesn't make sense because how am I using a spark plug with the completely wrong thread size and it just fits perfectly fine in my engine? The B threads are larger in diameter than the D. Was my spark plug hole re-tapped larger at some point? Or is this a different head on my cylinder? And I'm fairly sure I bought this spark plug new years ago, so why did I come across this and not the D8HA everyone else sells? My guess about the D8HA is they stopped making the original D6HS, and this is the closest replacement. 8 and 6 represent the heat range, and the A and S represent the N type. I'm sure that's its own technical thing, but it supposedly works. But more importantly, the D8HA should physically fit better than something like mine, which is a B thread size, right? Now, I'm sure some expert out there knows exactly what's up, but I just thought I'd share this strange confusion I'm coming across. Either way, this spark plug should maybe work for now. I mean, I know it's worked before and it clearly sparks. Later, I'll order a D8HA and see what's the deal with that myself, but I doubt it'll fit. Anyways, for now, I'll take my battery inside in case the cold or something on the bike drains it while I wait for the next day I can work on it. Alright, today's the day. I'm going to attempt to start the motorcycle. For this special occasion, even the weather has smiled upon me for once since I got the bike. I've got the carb ready, I got the spark ready, I got the Kickstarter ready, I checked the oil, and all that's left is to give it some fuel. The tank is empty, but it has been sitting for a while, so I'm gonna try to flush out any leftover old gas residue that may be lingering. To do this, I'll open the bottom of the petcock and dump it, unhook this connecting hose, and then just pour some gas on each side of the tank to rinse things out. I now realize this may not have been the cleanest method, but whatever, it works. Got gas in the bike, hooking up the battery, and lastly, I'll adjust the carb air screw 1.5 turns out as stated in the manual, and the idle screw a bit on the high side just to get things going. Now let's give it a test. I think the look on my face says it all. I swear that was my first take. I really did not expect the bike to start on the very first kick, so this is definitely a step in the right direction. I mean, I was thinking it'd at least start with a few tries and maybe run poorly for a few moments, but to just start so easily and run like it is amazing. Okay, now as much as I want to keep the engine going, I think I should probably install the exhaust muffler before someone in my apartment files a noise complaint. This is the original muffler. I left it off for the first start just in case it was clogged at all and would possibly prevent the bike from running, but now that I know it runs, I can test it with this on. Now, the exhaust is pretty beat up and rusty. I feel like there's supposed to be a gasket here, but I'll have to look and order one. The heat shield has a hole in it and was clamped on, probably because it rattled. I'm also going to go on a limb and say this mounting point was re-welded at some point. I may be wrong, but that doesn't look like a factory Honda weld, and if it is, I hope that guy got fired. I also don't know what this inlet thing is, and I can't seem to find it referenced in the manual either. Oh, and the last major note about the muffler is there is a hole in it, so it obviously leaks. I can also hear some small debris inside as I shake the exhaust, probably rust flakes or dirt. I do like the exhaust and I think it's cool, so I am hoping I can get it repaired at some point, but I'm unsure the cost and practicality of something like that yet. You can't buy a new one, but you can buy a new reproduction S90 exhaust, which is a different style that goes underneath the motorcycle. So worst case, I may consider that after I've exhausted all my options. Now to install it, thankfully I was smart enough to put the hardware back in its place when I took it off. Man, I could start this thing all day. I still need to see if it dies when warm and also test for air leaks. Now, I'm sure we've all been there, but as much as I want to spend the rest of the day testing and riding this bike, I unfortunately have some other obligations. My girlfriend's family is coming up to visit, so I gotta spend the day hanging with them. They are great people and fun to be with, but it'll be a long day knowing the bike runs, so I'll pack things up for now. Now, while the family was up, we walked around downtown and stopped at this antique shop, and sure enough, my girlfriend's dad spotted this book that just happens to be a repair manual for these 60s 90cc Hondas. My CL90 is even listed right there, so all in all, I'd say it was a great time. I already have a PDF of a similar service manual, but just having the physical book, especially since it's a secondary reference, is always a plus. Okay, so it's a lot later in the evening now, everyone's gone home, and I've been in my alley with a light testing the bike a little. It'll start up easily, but after maybe 5 to 10 minutes of idling, it finally dies. However, it does start right back up after and does the same thing. 5 or so more minutes, then dies. I even tried spraying carb cleaner around the intake. If the idle changes, then it proves there's an air leak and it's sucking in air, which is bad, but from what I could tell, it didn't seem to make a difference, surprisingly. I've done a bit of research, and it sounds like it could be maybe the valve clearance, so I just got back from the store to get a feeler gauge, and I'll check that now. The first thing to do is to remove this cap on the head. Well, great. My largest socket doesn't fit. I guess it's time to go back to the store. Well, at least I saved $5. Alright, I got my 23mm socket and can take this thing off now. There's one on top for the intake valve and one on the bottom for the exhaust valve. You also need to remove this flywheel cover as well. One kind of weird note is my flywheel actually says CT90 on it instead of CL90. Realistically, they probably are the same exact part, though it is strange it's been swapped. I guess there's a slight chance it came like this, but I'm not sure. Anyways, what we want to do is set the piston and flywheel to top dead center on the compression stroke. To do this, we turn the wheel to line up this T mark with this arrow. Now, since this is a 4-stroke engine, there are 2 top dead centers, one on the compression stroke and one on the exhaust stroke. We need it on the compression stroke. You know it's the compression stroke because as you turn the wheel counterclockwise, you should see the intake valve move a bit before you approach the T, just like that. If that didn't happen, then you need to turn the wheel another full rotation, then you should see it that time. That's because the cycles should go intake stroke, then compression stroke. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but with everything right, you should feel a bit of friction using a 0.002 inch or 0.05 millimeter feeler. Mine is a bit loose if anything, so I'll maybe give it a slight adjustment. Now, I'll be honest, the fact that it's loose means this probably isn't my issue. If your valve clearance is too tight, then the valves don't close all the way, and that causes leaks. But since mine are loose, that shouldn't be an issue. But whatever, I'm already here, so I'll still adjust them. To do this, you first need to loosen the nut with a wrench. Great, my smallest wrench is too big. Time to go to the store for the third time tonight. Basically, you just gotta loosen this 9mm locking nut a bit, then turn the middle thing to adjust the tightness. Once you get the clearance at 0.002 inches, then you can tighten the nut back up while holding the adjustment part to make sure it doesn't move. Again, make sure you do the same thing on the exhaust side too. With everything adjusted and back together, the bike still is pretty much the same, which I kinda expected. It'll start and run fine for a while, die, then start up and do the same thing again. Again, spraying carb cleaner on the stripped intake doesn't seem to make a difference either, surprisingly. I'm still pretty stumped, but hey, at least the gears and clutch seem to work. Well, great. I noticed the shifter was a bit loose, and not wanting another stripped Kickstarter situation, I tried tightening it, and after a few turns, the bolt just snapped right down the middle. I can't get the shifter off either, cause half of the bolt is still stuck in there holding it in place. With some needle nose pliers and lots of patience, I actually am able to slowly work it off little by little. I got the bolt threads just far enough to no longer be holding the shifter in place, but the shifter itself is still pretty locked on there for some reason. I gotta get it off though if I want to get this old bolt replaced. With some force, I can see it slowly working its way off, though I do feel bad just banging up this cover here. That's better. I swear, that took like 10 minutes, but I finally got it off. Here you can see the bolt still stuck there, but now I can use some heavier pliers to get it out. It's the next day, I went and bought a new bolt and got the shifter tightened down. The new bolt is a bit longer than I needed, but I guess at least if it snaps again, I'll have more threads to grab onto. The motorcycle still doesn't quite run right, but I really want to give it a test ride to give myself some motivation to keep going. Now, I gotta be honest, I don't actually have a motorcycle license. My 50cc scooter doesn't require one, and back in the day when I first got this bike, I never bothered getting a license cause, well, the thing never ran well enough to ride anywhere. I'm an honest, law-abiding citizen. I pay my taxes, I follow the rules, I would never harm anyone, so that being said, I have to ask myself, am I the type of person who would take the risk of a police officer pulling me over for illegally riding my motorcycle in my own back alley? Why no, officer. I would never. The bike ride's fine enough, I think, though all the cables definitely could use some adjusting. The brakes feel loose, the clutch feels heavy, and the throttle seems to stick a bit or have some friction when going back. But overall, it does feel great to ride the motorcycle again. I'm essentially back to the point I was at 6 years ago, but I'm determined to outdo my past self and get this thing fully rideable with no issues. I'll leave things here for now, but next video, we'll see what we can do to get the engine running how it should. Thanks for watching.